So we're.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Berg. I am a professor at Shippensburg University, and I wanted to welcome you all to our second Empowering Communities to Preserve Historic Places in the South Mountain workshop. I know some of you were here with us in Shippensburg a couple of weeks ago. Some of you are joining us for the first time, but we're really excited to see everyone who is here tonight, who is passionate about the work of historic preservation, and especially understands how important this is to defining the quality of life in the South Mountain region. I'd also like to just point out that this event is a partnership. There are a number of people here in the room who are part of that partnership. I'd like to mention Holly Smith, who represents the Shippensburg University Center for Land Use, David Smith, not related, who is with the Cumberland County Historical Society, and Sean as well, Cumberland County Historical Society. Elizabeth Grant, where are you, Elizabeth? Way in the back there, with the Cumberland County Planning Department. Frank Grumbine, where are you, Frank? Oh, Frank over there, with the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office. Historic Preservation Office, who is not able to be with us tonight, and Christine Musser, local historic preservation consultant. I would also like to thank our partners and hosts for tonight, the New Cumberland Public Library, and especially the wonderful support we've gotten from Director Black and from the Public Service Librarian, Rebecca Risotto, and the Library Foundation. So thank you for hosting us here tonight. We really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank Wegmans that did provide some food tonight. So please be sure to eat and think about Wegmans as you do. I want to let you know we've got savory food for the first part here. There are coffee and drinks in the back. And at the break, we are going to bring out some sweets too. So be ready. This workshop, I should also mention, is possible because of the support of our friends at the South Mountain Partnership. Julia Chain is here from South Mountain. Under the auspices of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, the funds were provided by the Community Conservation Partnership Program's Environmental Stewardship Fund under the administration of the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, the Bureau of Recreation and Conservation. So thank you for everyone who has made this night possible. I'd also just like to take a moment to recognize the elected officials with us tonight. If you want to stand up briefly and just say who you are and where you're representing. Is that you?
Hi, I'm Kelly Stewart.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, welcome and thank you for coming tonight. Our first workshop focused on the topic of why we are interested in the work of historic preservation, why it is important to preserve our historic places, the benefits of historic preservation, and how historic preservation links to the quality of life in our communities, the economy, and also the special sense of place we have here in our region. Tonight, we are building on that question of why by focusing on how to identify places that matter in our community. And then what we want to do is take steps to talk about how to document and share those important sites. So we started with why. Tonight's how to identify places. We're then planning 2 more workshops in the fall that will focus particularly on researching historic sites and resources for preserving historic sites. Our goal, by the way, in this workshop, the series is called Empowering Our Communities. And what we really are interested in doing is helping people to think about and helping all of us to think about how to be proactive in the work of historic preservation, not simply being reactive or playing defense when things we love are in danger, but taking steps that will really now work to protect places and be able to really keep them with us into the future. To lead off tonight, our keynote speaker, I am very pleased to introduce Mindy Crawford, who is the Executive Director of Preservation Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's only statewide nonprofit historic preservation organization. Mindy has been the director of Preservation Pennsylvania since 2006. And prior to that, she was with Historic York for 24 years, including 20 years as the organization's director. Mindy is someone who has been actively helping individuals, organizations, and communities across the state to preserve historic places and to identify places that matter for several decades. She's going to share with us tonight her thoughts on how we should approach the process of identifying places that matter in our community. So if you could join me in giving a warm welcome to Mindy Butler.
I started when I was 10. In case you were wondering, trying to do the math. Yeah. This one, right? No, this one? Why it matters. Just so you know too, this is in webinar format and we are recording it. If you do get questions, you'll want to repeat them because the microphone is there. So we can record them for a webinar. You just, yeah, started. I should be good. Great. All right. Yeah, great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Sure. Hello, everyone. I actually recognize a lot of faces. I'm very happy to be here. When Steve asked me if I would be interested in, sorry, I have to get rid of all kinds of things that you aren't seeing. Okay. Asked me if I'd be interested in talking tonight, and I gave him a choice of 2 different presentations, and he picked the one I didn't want him to pick. And I agreed that I would do it anyway. And so I just added some of the one that I really wanted to do in at the end. So you're getting like 2 for the price of 1. We started out many years ago in preservation when the National Trust had people stand in front of buildings and say, this place matters. And the wrong setting. Okay. Hang on, I'm sorry. Oh, yes. Right, I don't want to be closed captioned. I don't want any evidence. Oh, yes. Oh, got it. Hang on. I've got my tech guy here, so.
Okay, when you came in, you probably were handed the post survey sheet that you should have filled out and handed back. And if you didn't, please do so. I'm sorry. Yeah. And the post one is you'll get after the workshop for you to fill out. And then you can give that back. And there's a QR code with that. So you'll be able to do it.
Okay, you're good.
So if you're at the Shippensburg one, you already know about them. So thank you.
Sorry, guys. Thank you for your patience. I promise it'll be worth it. Yeah. Oh. I don't know what he's saying. Oh,
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Hi. Say hi to Scott.
Yep.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. If you hit from beginning, top left.
From display?
I probably see something different than you. Hit. Yep. So now there we go. Display settings. Under that, what are your options? Duplicate slideshow.
We got it. It's
Great.
correct here. Are you seeing the same thing?
Yep. It's correct here. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Great. Nice and loud. Okay. So this place matters. And that was based on some New Jersey who started off with the idea of not just any place, this place. And as I started to think about that, I realized that you all get to decide what you want to preserve, and you all get to decide what matters to you. So I'm just going to take you through some of the reasons why we might want to choose certain things to preserve and not others. So first question, something's threatened. Are you going to chain yourself to the bulldozer? I have never chained myself to a bulldozer. Christine might have. I'm not sure, but generally speaking, this is probably not the best way to preserve something. But these are the kinds of headlines that we see, and we see them all the time, and we feel very frustrated because we're losing our built environment at a much too fast rate and being replaced by lots of new things. But the headlines don't tell the whole story. And while, of course, those headlines grab our attention, there's a whole lot of preservation already being done. So why does all this old stuff matter? It's important to you. Got married, or the movie theater where you had your first date. That is the movie theater where I had my first date. Or maybe you care so much about a property that you're willing to stand out with a sign in the rain to try to protect it. So this is former Mayor Dilworth's house in Philadelphia. Or it's something that's important to the community. You all probably recognize Mount Tabor Church, which is certainly important to the community. But the one on the other side at Crawford County was a bridge that had been closed for so many years, the Meade Avenue Bridge. And even though it was never going to be opened up again, the community just loved it and they wanted to keep it. It was eventually demolished. Now you had a success story here with the Sheepford Road Bridge, but no one could understand why the community wanted to keep this bridge because they had already found new ways around that bridge and it was never going to open again. But because it was there and because they had always remembered it, that's why it was important to them. And some things, of course, are important for history, architectural history, American history, any kind of history. So those are a little easier to make choices about. It also gives us a sense of place. When you ask someone why they like a place, they can't really tell you why they like it, but they like it. Is it the architecture? Is it the plantings? Is it the vibe? Is it the people on the street? There's just something about certain places that you like. If you want to take a trip on the Lincoln Highway and stay at the Lincoln Motor Court in an old tourist cabin, that gives you a certain vibe as opposed to walking down the street and sitting at a cafe. Sometimes it's because we don't want to lose it. Preservation Pennsylvania owned the Star Barn for over 30 years because we were so concerned that it was going to be demolished. It's now been moved to Lancaster County, which is a save-ish. I mean, obviously things staying in the same place is better than moving them, but the Star Barn was never going to be rehabilitated in its original location. Or it's just a beautiful building because the day that this for sale sign goes up that says available for development, that's the building you think, what? Because it's probably not going to be redeveloped for commercial use. It's probably going to be demolished. So we have to pick those places that we just don't want to lose. Some places are vital parts of strong communities. I mean, if you've ever been to the Caramel, a pretty special place. I think it's been there for so long now that if it were to suddenly close, it would be devastating to the community because it's been there for so long. Or a theater. People love theaters, churches, courthouses, important buildings. It's part of the whole vibe of the community. It is also important for tourism. Leap the Dips is the only Pennsylvania roller coaster that is a National Historic Landmark, also listed on the National Register. The Coffee Pot along the Lincoln Highway. People love to tour things that are historic. Roller coaster enthusiasts travel to roller coasters all over the world. People who love to drive on the Lincoln Highway like large shoes, large coffee pots, large teapots. It is part of tourism. And we know that heritage travelers spend more money and more time than other travelers. They usually stay at least one extra day and spend about $50 more every day that they're here. So we want heritage travelers. It's also environmentally responsible. This building in Coatesville was demolished for a Rite Aid. And the Rite Aid existed for about 5 years before it closed. And the old Rite Aid building sat there for another 10 years. And so reusing our historic fabric instead of it going to the landfill is something that we always need to be saying. I mean, if you've all seen pictures of McDonald's that have been put into historic buildings, people reusing old buildings, I think it's the Lowe's in Tulsa is in an old historic building. And it's just so funny to come around the corner and see this amazing old building that with a big Lowe's sign on it. And so being environmentally responsible is good for us, good for the community, good for the world. And it also makes economic sense. Development and historic resources go together. They do not have to be against each other. There's a lot of convincing to do in order to get people to understand that. But historic resources do work for development. They give us economic vitality and a sense of place. This is a rehabilitated building in Bath that was converted to a coffee shop. It was one of our award recipients just a few years ago. And it's because these are the places that we want to live, work, and play. We don't want to live in a sterile environment. We don't want to live by the, I hate to use the word mall because does anyone go to the mall anymore? But I mean, you want to be in a town where there's a lot going on, where there's things to see, there's people on the street, there's bicycles, there's kids, there's a parade, there's historical societies and libraries. And so those are the places that people want to live. And that is what I feel preservation does. So historic resources and development, yes, but we all know that that doesn't necessarily mean everyone agrees with us. And so how do you decide what to save and what development to embrace? Some of the things I may say tonight might make you uncomfortable, but we're gonna talk about reality. So the first thing that you need to do to decide what to save is what is the character of your community? The community of New Cumberland and the community of Mount Holly Springs are two very different communities. So you need to figure out what's your character. What are the things that are most important in your community that you want to save? What are the resources? Thinking about Mount Holly Springs, there's the library, of course. That's something everybody recognizes when they drive by. So what are those resources? Those ones that you would chain yourself to a bulldozer for? And then it's interesting to make a list of them because I will tell you a brief story about a list that was made and then they ended up having to defend the one thing at the top of their list. So it's good for each community to sit down and think about what it is about them that makes it different from the next community. Mount Holly Springs is not going to be Carlisle. And it shouldn't be. So you should not be worrying about what anyone else has. You should be talking about your community. So what are those resources? Do you have an iconic building? Is it a library? Is it a courthouse? Is it a lot of beautiful Queen Anne architecture? Is it row houses? What are the things that you think of when you think about the architecture and the historic resources in your community? And how do you identify yourselves? Do you identify yourselves as a small community that's very friendly with a lot going on with a lot of children? Or do you identify yourself as, a more urban city that has a college, a small college, or is the center of county government? I mean, each one of those communities are going to be very different in the way that you think about what needs to be preserved, because the bigger your community, the more development pressure you're going to have, because there's always a need to build new buildings. And if we didn't build new buildings, we wouldn't have 1740, 1840, 1940, and perhaps 2040 buildings, because we're always going to be building. And then how do others identify you? Are you a community that people come to because you have all the antique stores they could possibly want? Are you the community that has a music festival? Are you the community that is very historic and has a reenactment, or has an honorary signing of the Declaration of Independence, or whatever your niche thing is? In Hanover, where I live, they've changed everything to Snack Town because Hanover, of course, has a lot of snack food. We have 7 pretzel companies and 3 potato chip companies. And so we are now called Snacktown. So now we have the Snacktown Brew Fest and the Snacktown Run and the Snacktown Street Fair. And of course, no one can tell the difference anymore because they're all called Snacktown and nobody knows when any of them are. So this is not advice to you. This is advice to not follow. But if everyone's going to start calling Hanover Snacktown, you know, that's going to change the way people think about it. So I think it's important for you, a group of people to sit around and say, what is it about our community that makes it special? Do you have a vision? Is your vision Breezewood or is your vision Lancaster? Please tell me it's not Breezewood. That would make me very sad. Although, you know, Breezewood is its own place and there's really nothing like it. So how do you decide what to preserve? And I say this again, it is up to you. I mean you individually, you, the community, you, the organization. You get to decide what are the ones you're going to fight for. I can tell you that there are many people in Pennsylvania that believe that I personally should help them save every single thing in the state, or at least that's what it feels like. I can't say yes to everyone. And so I need to empower you all to do some of this work because I am only one person and I can't save everything in Pennsylvania. So we all need to be well-informed and know how to do that. I'm not suggesting that the only way you can save something is to stand outside of it with signs, but I think that's what people tend to think of when we talk about fighting to save a historic resource. In one case, this was Abolition Hall in Montgomery County, which they were successful. It was a successful save. The other one was La Ronda in Montgomery County. This little boy just cracks me up. He drew the building that he didn't want to see demolished. And unfortunately, it was demolished. Being proactive and planning is the key. These things do not happen by themselves. It is your job to find out when every planning commission, supervisors meeting, council meeting, zoning meeting, any meeting at all, you have elected the officials that are in your community and run them. And they are supposed to listen to you. So when you see something on the agenda that you want to know about, you go there. Yes, it is a lot of late meetings sitting on really uncomfortable chairs, but this is where things happen. And they don't happen all of a sudden. If you're following along, you will see that project show up on maybe the Planning Commission agenda 1 month. And then it might not show up again until it's zoning, you know, several months later. By the time it gets to Borough Council, and I'm just using that word generically, it may be too late. So it is your job to be informed. Is there a comprehensive plan for your county or for your community? Do you have zoning? And this is something that coming from South Central Pennsylvania, I just assume everybody has zoning, but I talk to people in the northern part of the state, they have no zoning at all. So zoning can be a very effective tool for historic preservation, but it doesn't save everything. And if you don't have it, you're kind of out of luck. Do you have a historic district, a National Register district or a local review district in Pennsylvania called HARBS? Is there any open space preservation programs? Does anyone accept conservation or historic easements? The other thing that you have to have is patience and determination because these things do not happen quickly. They happen at an absolute snail's pace. It feels like all of a sudden something's coming down. But if you're following the process, you will learn that it is not happening as quickly as you might think. So how do you decide what to save? First of all, you have to know what you have. And I'm sure that Frank is going to talk about survey, inventory, photography, research. But it's something that volunteers can do. I mean, maybe you don't know the name of every architectural style, but you have cameras, mostly on your phones, even if you don't have a camera. Getting pictures of what you have and getting an inventory so that you know what you have is really, really important because you can look at that building every day for 2 years and think, oh, it's a nice building. I hope something good happens to it. And you drive by one day and there is a bulldozer in the front yard and the building is gone. That didn't happen overnight. That happened over a long period. So you need to know what you have. Then you have to prioritize the resources that mean the most to you. You can't save everything, but you can work extra hard to save the ones you don't want to lose, and familiarize yourself with how that all works in your community. So the story of Camp Security, in 1998, the Springettsbury Township supervisors tasked the newly formed Historic Preservation Committee to come up with the top 10 must not lose resources in their township. And they did. They went around and they looked at survey work that had been done. They drove, they made suggestions, and they came up with their top 10. At the top of the list was Camp Security, which is a prisoner of war camp from the Revolutionary War. In 1999, a proposal was submitted to build 110 townhouses on Camp Security. It had previously just had a blue marker from the PHMC noting that it was the place of a prisoner of war camp. And the next 10 to 15 years were spent saving all of Camp Security, except the portion that had been lost in the 1960s when a housing development went in. And in the end, it's the township that owns Camp Security. And every year they do a little bit of an archaeological dig. Last year they found the edge of the fort. They've been working their way along, and now they're doing a plan. The township is doing a plan for how they're going to interpret and use Camp Security going forward. But that was at the top of their list. And so figure out what that list is for you and be ready to jump if something happens. So here is, a threatened resource. What do you do? Is it on your list of must not lose? What is the threat? Is the threat demolition or is it inappropriate development? Is it too late? Sometimes it's too late. When the demo permit is posted on the building, there's very little you're going to do to get it out. What does a win look like to you? Do you want to stop, or do you want to have a better designed project? Or do you want the project to not happen at all? You have to very nicely listen to the opposition. I've always said that debate in high school was the very best thing I did, because you really need to understand both sides of the story as much as it kills you to do so. Knowing all of the story before you be passionate, of course, but also listen to what else is being said. Stay at the table, but know when to walk away. There's going to be a point where you're not going to make a difference. And you have to, don't take your marbles and go home. Just thank everyone for their time and walk away. Be sure that the resource is documented before it's lost. Then you can wallow in self-pity and eat ice cream. Then think about the lessons you learned. Did you get involved too late? Were there no protections in place that maybe you could work to have happen? Did you find out about it too late because you weren't paying attention? What were the things that you learned, and what will you do better the next time? Because you do not want to burn all your bridges on one fight. A good portion of your life fighting the next fight. Yes, Christine, I'm looking at you. Christine and I, we understand each other now. So the reality check is, a plan to preserve is only a plan. You might not be successful. This is a long game. This is many hours sitting in meetings, making phone calls, getting people to join you, trying to get meetings with people, calling legislators. Legislators are great, but they can't always do anything for what's happening. You can't assume that they're going to just swoop in and make everything go away. Can anything be done? I mean, if you've got a building that is falling to ruin, no matter how wonderful it is, and it's owned by a person who has no interest in selling it, no interest in getting any help, there's nothing you can do. Unfortunately, it could fall down with demolition by neglect. You can't force someone. Now, if your municipality has codes enforcement, there's a start. But remember, if the person decides they are willing to get rid of it, now you have to come up with the money to buy it. And I don't know about you, but Preservation Pennsylvania doesn't have any big pots of money, and I imagine none of you do either. So you need to be thinking about what are all the things that you're doing. Could you find someone who might be interested in buying it? Could you bring some people together? You're not going to do it with a Kickstarter. as tempting as that might seem, we're talking about money that is going to have to be, carefully raised. And then knowing when it's over or celebrating the win. This is when the Gettysburg Casino was defeated for the first time. I didn't get a picture of the second time or the third time, but they celebrated that win. So historic resources are a source of economic vitality and a sense of place. You got to decide what you don't want to lose, figure out where development could happen, because guess what? Your municipality can make that decision. If you give them input as they work on their comprehensive plan, you can say, these areas here should be protected because this is where all the most historic things are. Over here, this is an area where we could do development. If you don't have it scheduled in the plan, they don't have to say yes. If you have If you have a good plan, the municipality doesn't have to say yes if their zoning or their plan says this isn't where development occurs. So you need to think about being proactive and deciding if we're going to allow development to happen that's not historic development, where could that be? What are the areas that you want to stay away from? You need to plan for good projects, and you should not be afraid to say no. But don't live in the land of no, where you say no to all development, because you want to be able to say yes to either the right project or the right compromise. Because if everyone's unhappy, then you probably have a good compromise. Yes, it's true. So instead, we want to see these kinds of headlines. All headlines taken from, you can't get good newspaper headlines anymore because print newspaper. So I've managed to get them to come up on the screen and make a little cut of them, but I kind of like it now. I've actually become a little bit obsessed about keeping headlines. And then food for thought. I'll give you a moment to read that. Or I'll read it to you. Only the foolish city will make the choice between historic preservation and economic development. The wise city will effectively utilize its historic built environment to meet the economic, social, and cultural needs of its citizens far into the future. Donovan Ripkema presented that in 1989, and it is still true today. So that is what I have to say. Are you inspired? I did put a little card at the back table if you want to pick it up. It has a QR code that takes you to our website. And you can also download our Protect and Preserve the Places That Matter to You from our website.
Our thought tonight was that Mindy would give us a little bit of the inspiration and overview. And our next speaker is going to be Frank Grumbine, who is the Central Region Community Preservation Coordinator for the State Historic Preservation Office. And I saw that Frank has a picture of his map. He is the official person at the state. If you have a question from the New York border to the Maryland border, and I don't know how far east and west, but he is his phone. If you have a preservation question, his phone is the one that you will call from this region. So Frank, if you'd like to, Frank's going to give us some practical tips on and resources on identifying historic resources.
It's so nice to see everybody here tonight on such a lovely evening where you could have just stayed home and kept gardening or grooming your horse or painting your living room, whatever you do. Thank you, Mindy, for your inspiration. You've inspired me my whole life. And moving to preserve places and many others who are here tonight. I'm Frank Grumbine. I'm the Central Region Community Preservation Coordinator for the State Historic Preservation Office. I primarily help municipalities, counties, local nonprofit organizations, residents, taxpayers, constituents, anybody with a heartbeat generally that needs help with preservation matters. And it's challenging. It's very challenging. but it's rewarding, because I'm very passionate about our built environment and how we ourselves and as individuals, but as culture, as a culture, attach ourselves to the places that we care about. Thank you for being here tonight. So here is the Grand Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. My region is the green, but those are fluid sometimes. My colleague Bill in the west and my colleague Megan in the east. And as Dr. Berg has stated, if any of you have preservation questions or concerns, feel free to get a hold of any of us. Whether or not we can solve those problems is another matter. But I'm more than happy to help with anything you may need assistance with. So a little bit about me. I grew up in York County, about 10 miles from here, just over on the other side of the Yellow Breeches. And and I grew up in Goldsboro, right in front of 3 Mile Island, swimming in the river. And we used to walk on the railroad down to New Cumberland, and dangerously jump out of the way when the train would come around. But nonetheless, it's memories like that, whether they're precarious, dangerous, or emotional, is why we care about historic places. And so it's just, so why do historic places matter to you? It depends. All of us have different answers. All of us have different experiences. And all of us have different frames of references in our lives that make places matter to us. We all grew up in presumably a house, maybe a barn, I don't know. And those places are where we develop memories, where we develop relationships, where we cry, where we live, and where we make mistakes. It's how we define ourselves in the world that we live in. And that's why buildings matter. That's why landscapes matter, because we are animals just like any other animal that has lived on the planet. And we rely on these places and these resources for our sustenance and our survival. And we deserve beautiful places. We deserve places that have character. We deserve places that mean something to us. And that includes new places. We can build new places and we can develop things appropriately, where we can develop and have new memories that mean or valuable to us in our society, and in our communities. So a big thing to me of why I do preservation, and I guess you can kind of allude to, is our connection to place, and how we attach ourselves to reality. I'd like to think we all live in a similar or the same reality, but that might not necessarily be true. But nonetheless, our personal and our community attachment to these places makes a difference, and it matters because that's how people make decisions on where they live, where they work, how they spend money, how they don't spend money. So how our built environment reflects our shared history and our shared heritage matters to both our communities today and our communities tomorrow. So what matters to who? This is a really tough question that I get from a lot of communities. And communities call me and ask, well, what should we plan for? What should we preserve? I say, that's up to you. That's not my call. I don't live in your community. This is your home. This is your place. And you make the decisions of what to advocate for, what to plan for, and what to preserve. So there's always a subjectivity of importance at the local level. There are kind of gradients of how to interpret and understand in significance in terms of local, statewide, national, or international, in terms of historical value. But in historic preservation and, in the practice of history in general, there are lots of gaps. There are lots of groups of people and lots of stories that have been ignored, that have been subjected to the archives, and that have been never truly studied. And there are stories in our communities that we have yet to uncover. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things about studying the past, is that there's always something to discover. There's always something to find. There's always something to learn. History is a dynamic science. It's a dynamic study. Nothing's ever stagnant, and we're always discovering who we are through our past. And that's why preservation is important to me as well. So I also get a lot of questions about the National Register. Yeah, well, the National Register will protect my house, right? Will protect my district, will protect my community. No, it doesn't. But it's a good tool to plan for your communities. It's a good tool to identify what is important in your communities. But it doesn't protect resources. It helps advocate for what's important in your community, but it's not necessarily a regulatory tool to at the local level. So I mentioned the National Register criteria because it's a good framework to understand how to evaluate what's important in your community. So criterion A, B, C, and D. Criterion A is generally events that are significant in the history. B is important, associated with important people of the past. C is architecture, and D is information value. Generally, D is archaeological potential or significance, but it also can apply to buildings as well. And of course, integrity. So when you're evaluating significance, you're also evaluating integrity. Does the resource with said significance have the integrity that from that period of significance? And I won't talk about the National Register too much, but evaluating integrity and significance are both important aspects to understand what is historic in your community. And in terms of research, cognitive and unconscious biases in historical research. So when you're referencing archives, records of the past, understanding the frame of reference of those who developed those records, whatever type of records they are, understanding their worldviews and how they saw the world in the past at that specific period of time. So trying to place yourselves in their shoes and how they saw the world. When you're evaluating records, who made this record and for what purpose? That's an important question to ask yourselves when you're, delving into archives or any type of research. Why does that record exist? What was the purpose of developing or publishing or writing that record? And what is missing from that record? The lack of information is information, and voids of information are tools to understand the past. And of course, cherry picking and objectivity and searching for the truth. Having preconceived notions of what you're researching is important, but it's also also important to keep an open mind and understanding that you will find information that conflicts with what you feel is the truth. And you have to be prepared to acknowledge that and accept it in your capacity of searching for the truth. So I like maps. I'm sure many of you also like maps. But in evaluating maps, my point of evaluating what is missing from the record is just as important as what is included in the record. And it's fascinating because looking at maps and evaluating what hasn't been recorded on a map is important information. So this is a 1858 atlas of New Cumberland and Lower Allen Township. So where to start? What places hold significance in my community? Again, that's subjective, but in New Cumberland, the Yellow Breeches and the Susquehanna are wildly significant, among other things. And when developing research questions, it's important to stay away from, crazy theories and hypotheses that generally don't make sense. And it's important to keep things simple. Conspiracy theories are fun, sure. But they generally don't hold a lot of water when you test it with the scientific method of history. So developing hypotheses, the Yellow Breeches and the Susquehanna are important because, largely because people rely on water for food, travel, power, and sustenance, or is because abundant water is required to summon river eels to develop an advanced civilization. Both of these could be true, but the first one's a lot simpler and straightforward. While the second one, you could pull a lot of your archival research together and make that potentially true. But when it comes down to peer review and scientific rigor to test that hypothesis, it may not hold up too well. So when faced with two equally good hypotheses, choosing the simpler hypothesis, Occam's razor. Types of resources to test hypothesis. Primary sources and secondary sources. Many of you are hopefully familiar with what these are, but it's important to have a baseline of how to use these resources. Primary sources are sources that provide insight directly from those who experience the past. Various records, books, photos, oral histories, some newspapers, physical items from the past. Secondary sources are those developed by others interpreting the past, so secondhand information. Many secondary resources are good points to start from to understand where primary resources that exist, or where they are housed, or what type of resources to go to. So here's a lovely primary resource of the town that I live in. This is an 1834 plat map of Lewisberry, York County. This is a really cool map. It has owners on the parcels, and all the parcels are labeled. But what I wanted to understand is, as an exercise, is okay. So there's this old looking house on my street. I don't know anything about it. So I look at this map and I see, okay, it's right there. So I know it existed in the 1834 when this map was redrawn. So I know it is at least that old. And then I evaluate other resources. So, okay, I don't know anything about my town. And I go to an earlier map. So I see an earlier map that shows my town on it. So I go, okay, maybe it is older, as old as the earlier map, but there isn't enough detail to evaluate whether or not that specific building exists. So, and then, you start to evaluate other resources, evaluating the architecture of the building materials, the form, its site, its setting, other kind of physical characteristics that I can evaluate to understand the age of the building. And then other resources such as more recent maps relative to the other two maps. This is an 1858 atlas business directory. So I could see that the building is on this map as well. So I kind of have a cache of resources to at least peer into the peephole of history to understand this specific resource. and maps are great. I mean, they reveal so much information about the past and why places exist and why and how places have developed. So one big way to engage in to understand what places matter in your community is community engagement. It's the most direct and, quite honestly, it's the easiest way to understand what matters in your community. Talking to your neighbors, talking to your family members, talking to you know, going to your local watering hole and having conversations with people that are there. Your local government, evaluating comprehensive plans, old published your local government might have, and whatnot. Folklore and storytelling. Storytelling is an ancient tradition, and I'm sure all of us are guilty of that tradition as well. And you know, those stories are passed along generation after generation, and they are great tools to evaluate the past and maybe test those stories with your archival research, because as you may find that some of them are quite readily embellished and fanatical sometimes, and of course, like generational knowledge from your family and your friends. To me, this is the best place to start when evaluating places in your community, because these story it's the folklore of storytelling and community attachment to places is really fascinating. Archival and institutional research. So this is the typical way of how people think when they think about evaluating resources and tools to understand what historic places exist in your community. Your local library is a great place to start. I used to spend many hours both here and in my local library checking out the local history books, because, like, you know, they only published like 10 of them 50 years ago, and the library has one and you can't check it out, and they got to watch you the whole time so that it doesn't slip away. And I would just sit there and read and you know, libraries hold a special place in evaluating and understand in your community. Historical societies, you know, they have great resources. It varies upon, you know, look, historical societies and their scope and scale, but they're also a very good source for understanding what matters in your community and the history of your place. Universities, students are always willing to work, and they have great resources that can help you understand what is important in your community. County archives and courthouses, you know, deed researches and deed transfers and property transfers are great resources to understand how property has changed and the science of place has changed. The state archives and the state library. I say PHMC in general, but depending on what you're looking for, I would defer to the state archives and you know, there's PA Share. PA Share is a resource that is an online database with spatial data that you can identify historic places that have been documented. So here is a map of New Cumberland with a lot of spatial data that exists of historic resources that exist. The Library of Congress and many internet resources. The internet has opened up a can of worms to search for resources that exist to perform your research to understand what is important in your community. You know, the state archives and the state library. There's the postcard collection, and Linda is an amazing resource here in New Cumberland, but she is institutional knowledge of photographs and postcards and everything Pennsylvania, and I applaud all her work in the past to help do all this stuff. She has done a lot for people like us to be able to research these places. But you know, yeah, Pen Pilot, aerial imagery. Aerial imagery is one of my favorite things. Here's an aerial photo of New Cumberland, 1939, I believe. Super cool, pretty high resolution, and you can really get a sense of how communities have changed over time, particularly in the 20th century, with the rise of the automobile, interstate highways, suburban sprawl, and all these types of things. And maps are one of my favorite resources to use. Physical interpretation. This is my favorite way to evaluate what is important in your community. And of course, this takes some training and understanding what historic buildings are, and historic places are. But it doesn't take an expert. It really doesn't take an expert to identify what places are old or historic. And I guess there's the differentiation between old and historic. Just because a place is old doesn't necessarily mean it's historic. So, a building that has been completely gutted, encapsulated with vinyl siding, doesn't have any original materials, may not necessarily be historic for its architecture, but perhaps it has cultural significance. Perhaps it has some type of other significance tied to that resource. But physical interpretation is how I generally like to evaluate a place at first. So reading a place, it's fun to read places. It's fun to read books as well, but reading totally a cool thing to do. And it's kind of like, I think everybody here has that hobby of reading places, whether you're good at it or not. Reading a place or reading a building, more specifically, evaluating the type of building and its style. Architectural styles are cool, and they're important tools to understand what a building is and how it was designed, or what period it was constructed. But I feel that in the past, preservation has been fixated too much on architectural styles and jamming buildings into boxes, and because very rarely a building is distinctly a style, because buildings have features from many styles, perhaps. Materials. Materials for a long time have been basic natural materials, stone, wood, metal. In the late 19th century, materials started to change with rapid industrialization, and new materials started to emerge, particularly in the 20th century. Synthetic materials, particularly after World War II, everybody loves their asbestos. It's held up great. So identifying historic materials, the history of materials, and how these are applied to buildings can help you understand how a building has evolved over time. The form of a building. The form of a building refers to its shape and its situation and its location. As you can see here, there's a variety of building forms. The center one that has a really steep roof, that's a story and a half. That's an early Pennsylvania Dutch blacksmith shop built in 1740. Has the clay tile roof, which is a really cool feature. And the bottom left is a federal kind of style building, constructed of also local sandstone in Venango County. The top left is the Northumberland County Courthouse, which Cumberland County has a really cool, jail. Cumberland County also has a similar style jail. So building forms can inform us of when these buildings were constructed, with what materials and where those materials come from. The setting of buildings. So how the buildings are situated in their environment is important. So for example, in an urban environment, are these buildings situated right on the sidewalk? Are they oriented in a way that is odd or unusual? Or the bottom right photo is a CCC octagonal cabin in Clearfield County, which is really cool. And it's a unique resource. But it's not a typical resource that you would come across, but it's unusual. And you may not necessarily know the history of a place, but it's cool. And features and craftsmanship of a building are important tools to evaluate and read a building. So craftsmanship is interesting in terms of how a building was constructed. I always like masonry buildings because you could see how a craftsman, worked the face of a stone or cut a stone. You could see saw marks in lumber. You could see all these features as identifiers to understand when a building was constructed. Interpretation of reading a place, a larger scale, town, city, landscape. So this is another photo of New Cumberland, Fairview Township. On the right, you could see Capital City Airport. And this photo is dated October of 1949, I believe. And on the bottom left, you could see that big cut. Anybody know what that cut is? That is the Pennsylvania Turnpike being constructed. So aerial photos are great tools to understand your community and how it has changed. The world-class Pennsylvania's superhighway. And this was the extension from Carlisle after the original turnpike was constructed. So street patterns. Street patterns are important to understand an urban environment particularly, and also rural environments. But systematically plan places, in the Pennsylvania plan, gridded cities and towns are unique in that, their market squares and their courthouses and churches. So it's really cool because a lot of these resources exist in terms of the plats and the early maps that exist. Natural features. So natural features are good indicators to understand a sense of place. For example, where mills existed, there might be remnant pieces of abutments or dams. With old forges or mills, there will be ruins of those features that exist in the landscape. Those are good features to understand the history of a place. And also, natural features that exist. For example, reading a forested landscape, the age of trees, how do those trees and those ages correlate with the development of a neighborhood or a place? When you see those big oak trees in like a early 20th century neighborhood, you're like, wow, those trees are cool and they're huge. Such as in New Cumberland, you see massive pin oak trees, and they correlate with the age of the buildings. So those are good kind of dating features that you could use to understand the age of a place. Growth patterns. Aerial images are great for growth patterns to understand how a place has changed over time. Building styles and rhythms, what types of buildings exist and how do they correlate with each other. And then, of course, culture, ethnic association and religious associations in the community, such as churches and types of ethnographic resources that exist in a place. So here's New Cumberland, and this is the same photo, but it's just blown up a little bit. And here is a new expansion of New Cumberland in 1949, post-war. So you could see that the street pattern has changed a little bit to reflect a kind of a different way of planning, of suburban planning almost. And the street pattern is not necessarily uniform with the existing street pattern. And you could see that, on Second Street there's bare soil that indicating that these buildings were generally just constructed. And that would be these houses. So now you understand, you can have the tools to understand, okay, I can read these buildings and I know they're probably 20th century, but now I have the archival, photographic, and physical evidence that exists for me to understand that these were constructed, sometime after World War II and before 1950. So that gives you a good window of time to understand how a place has changed and when they were constructed. And New Cumberland has awesome residential stock, really cool residential stock that totally should be planned for and preserved. So where to start with a community survey? It's not the easiest thing in the world, but it's not the hardest either. So doing your research, doing your archival research, and understanding the context of the place, understanding general themes of history and how a place has changed over time, and understanding that places are difficult to understand, buildings are difficult to understand because they have existed so long and they have been mucked up. But nonetheless, evaluating them and the general themes of how a community has changed over time is important. Methodology. What types of resources are you surveying, and how will you document and collect the data? So what do you want to record, and how will you document that information and collect that data? Recordation. How will you document the resources, and where will that information live? So a lot of times surveys are done and they get buried in a pile on a shelf somewhere and nobody can access that information. That's not super helpful. So understanding the methodology of how you do your survey and where that information will live and to have it be accessible to everybody is important for people to do additional research on that place. And the most important thing is you allowing that information to be available to people to plan to preserve those places. Far often, like I was saying, it's difficult to find that information for people to make thoughtful, reasonable decisions on what to do with historic places and how to plan for them. So making this information available to everybody is important. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And I'm available for questions or cornering in the future. Thank you.
So I can still do this. I'll use my professor voice. So what we wanted to do tonight was to give you a little bit of an opportunity to start to think about identifying resources in a historic community. That if we're going to do this work of trying to learn from people in our community, to go out into the field and research, one of the initial steps is going to be thinking about what kinds of resources do we want to identify. How can we think about, what might be important as a historic resource? And so one of the things that we as a group, as we were planning out this session, we thought one of the things that would be nice would be to have you do a little bit of, just take a couple of minutes to think about a community. I don't know, I know some of you are experts on New Cumberland. How many people are experts on the history of New Cumberland? Okay, we have two. That's great. So you are all newbies here, which is excellent. Christine, could you do me a favor? There's also a pile of papers right in front of you that are blue. Can we distribute those to people as well? This is a little mini history of New Cumberland if you want to also have that as a resource. So what we would like you to do is to look at a series of maps here and to try to think about if you were starting to do historic preservation in New Cumberland, what might be some of the things that you would think about? And so what we have provided you with here are actually 4 different maps in your packet. You have the first of these maps is the Bridgens HF map of Cumberland County from 1858. This, by the way, some of you may have seen these. They are gigantic maps that have then been broken down into individual communities. But the first map that you have in your packet is the New Cumberland. I also gave you a little table of some statistics that were in that map as well. The second map that you have in your packet is from the F.W. Beers Company Atlas of 1872. And so this is a second atlas map of the borough of New Cumberland in 1872. The third and fourth maps that are in your packet are actually from the Sanborn Fire Insurance Company maps. For anyone who is doing historic preservation research, you are probably familiar with the Sanborn Fire Company insurance maps. The Sanborn Company existed from the 1860s until the 1970s. And their purpose was to create these maps to try to sell insurance policies and to be able to rate what kind of fire risk certain buildings had. And so what's interesting about these maps is they were using it for selling insurance policies. We as historic preservationists can look and get all kinds of amazing details about these buildings. One of the things that you will find really interesting is there is a little bit of a key, and I realize you need to have super good vision to read the key, but one of the things that you'll notice is the buildings that are on here that are yellow are frame or wood buildings. The buildings that are pink are brick buildings. The buildings that are blue are stone buildings. And that you can even get into more detail. They will tell you if there's a D on it, it means it's a dwelling, so it's a residence. It will sometimes put the name of what a building is, the Methodist Church. But it will tell us how many stories the building is, what the building is made out of, whether it has fire protective walls. You can also see on here, there's little dots that indicate what the roof was made out of. So whether it was a slate roof or a tin roof, tons and tons of details about these historic buildings. Plus, they traced out the historic outline of the building as well. So if you're looking at a building today, you can see, have there been additions since that early time? So you've got New Cumberland on the east, I guess it's not the east side, it's the north side and the south side of New Cumberland, 2 separate maps here. And you can sort of see that. And then the very last thing I gave you here was a view from Google Earth. I would encourage you that if you're trying to historic resources in a community, you can do it on foot, you can do it on bike, you can drive around and do what's called a windshield survey. But Google Earth also gives you an amazing opportunity to literally drop down into communities and virtually walk along the streets if you want to look for historic resources. So what I'd like you to do is to take a couple of minutes now and look at these maps and what we would like you to think about, and you can share and point out things with the people sitting next to you. If you were starting a survey of New Cumberland, looking for historic resources, what are some of the things that strike you? What are some of the important places you might focus on? What are things that you see here in the maps about the historical development? Frank, anything else you wanted to add? Okay, so just take a couple of minutes, if you would, and feel free to share thoughts with your neighbors. And if anybody. Yeah, you know, $5 is worse. We are now at the end of the evening, so, Charlie, do you want to say what we should be doing for the food service? Announcements. One is I did want to say that we do have the date set for our workshop number 3, which is going to focus on researching historic properties. That's going to be September 17th, which is a Tuesday at the Cumberland County Historical Society. Bill, have another.
Yeah, actually, everyone, always catch real quick. I'm Sean Black, I'm the executive director at the Cumberland County Historical Society. Just to let everyone know, we're in the process of making some of our records more accessible.